On a Friday night, by the Northway Dynamics coffee machine, my husband said, "It's over. I'm with Claire." The air conditioner hummed. The scent of printer ink was sharp, and his words landed like a bankruptcy notice. What he didn't know is that I'm the one who sees every log, signature, and greedy fingerprint. If they chose the office as their battlefield, I'd choose the records as my weapon, and I never miss my shot. My name is Maren Keats. I am 34 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I was one half of a marriage. Professionally, I am the head of compliance for Northway Dynamics, a mid-cap tech firm in the perpetually damp city of Bracken Falls. My job is to see the patterns people think are invisible, to connect the dots they pray no one will notice. I am the architect of the corporate firewall, the guardian of the rulebook, the human algorithm that flags a rounding error as a potential felony. My world is built on a foundation of verifiable facts, digital signatures, and the immutable logic of process, which is why the raw, illogical chaos of this moment feels like a physical assault. Evan, my husband, had dragged me into the break room not with force, but with a hissed urgency that was more compelling than any physical grip. He steered me by the elbow, past the glowing vending machine humming its electric mantra, and parked me in the sterile space between the industrial-grade microwave and the perpetually stained coffee station. The air was thick with the Friday afternoon scent of burnt popcorn and institutional cleaner. The last remaining employees were ghosting through the hallways, their laughter echoing with the hollow relief of a week concluded. For me, the week, and life as I knew it, was about to detonate. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes, the same shade of hazel that I had once found comfortingly steady, were now shifty, darting from the motivational poster about teamwork to the recycling bin overflowing with soda cans. A fine sheen of sweat coated his upper lip, and his breathing was shallow, ragged, the breath of a man who had run a great distance to deliver a terrible message. "Maren," he started, his voice a strained whisper. He cleared his throat, a dry scraping sound. "This isn't working. It hasn't been for a while." He finally risked a glance at me, but his focus was somewhere over my left shoulder. "It's me and Claire. We're done." The words were so simple, so brutally efficient, not a plea for understanding, not a mournful confession, but a corporate declaration, a merger and acquisition. His assets were being moved to a new entity. I was being liquidated. Claire. Of course. It was Claire Rowan, the new PR manager, a whirlwind of ambition who had arrived 3 months ago with a portfolio as glossy as her crimson lipstick. Her presence in the office wasn't a footstep. It was an announcement. The sharp, confident click-clack of her designer heels on the polished concrete floors had become the office's new metronome, a sound that, I now realized, had been counting down to this very moment. She was a human press release, all dazzling headlines and carefully curated sound bites, and my quiet, methodical husband had apparently decided he wanted to be her next big story. My fingers went numb. The cheap, paper coffee cup I was holding, emblazoned with the cheerful Northway Dynamics logo, slipped from my grasp. It seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling end over end before it hit the pristine white linoleum. The dark, bitter coffee erupted from the cup, splashing across the floor in a chaotic, spidery pattern. My first, detached thought wasn't of my broken marriage. It was a professional observation. The stain looked exactly like a data leak diagram, a visual representation of a catastrophic system breach, its dark tributaries reaching into every clean, orderly corner, an uncontrolled release of sensitive information into an unsecured environment. Out of the corner of my eye, I could sense the other human beings in the vicinity freezing. Dave from accounting, who had been meticulously selecting a bag of pretzels from the vending machine, suddenly became intensely focused on the machine's glowing coils, as if deciphering the secrets of the universe in their orange light. Sarah from marketing, who had been laughing loudly by the water cooler, abruptly ended her conversation, her head ducking down to scrutinize the label on a bottle of sparkling water. They were trying so hard to be invisible, to give us the illusion of privacy, but their silence was deafening, Their ears were high-gain microphones, absorbing every syllable of my public humiliation. This wasn't a private moment. It was a corporate spectacle, and I was the featured disaster. Evan seemed completely oblivious to the audience. His focus was singular, executing his exit strategy. "I'll get my stuff this weekend," he said, his tone devoid of any emotion. It was the same flat, declarative voice he used in product meetings to announce a feature delay. It was the voice of a man reading from a script, a man for whom this conversation was just a line item on a project plan, a box to be checked. The man I married had whispered poetry in my ear on a rainy Tuesday. This man spoke like a living memorandum, cold, concise, and utterly final. A strange calm settled over me. The initial shock receded, replaced by the familiar hum of professional instinct. My brain, trained to compartmentalize and analyze risk, began to triage the situation. The personal injury was severe, catastrophic even, but it was an emotional variable that could not be processed at this time. It had to be quarantined. So, I did what I do when a senior vice president is screaming about a compliance hold on his multi-million-dollar deal. I locked it all down. The tears that pricked at the back of my eyes were denied clearance. The scream that was building in my chest was placed on indefinite administrative leave. My entire emotional response system was shut down, sealed behind a firewall so thick nothing could get through. The vault door slammed shut. I gave him a single, sharp nod, an acknowledgement of receipt. As if on cue. My phone, lying face up on the counter beside the coffee spill, vibrated with a soft buzz. It was a notification from the Aegis system, the automated compliance monitoring suite I had designed and implemented myself. My baby. It was an alert I'd configured to flag any corporate card transaction over a certain threshold that received manual approval outside of standard business hours. My eyes flicked to the screen. Alert. Non-standard transaction. Vendor ID 77B PR Blue Fern. Amount $25,000. Approval C. Rowan. Time 5:42 p.m. Friday. The letters swam into focus, sharp and damning. C. Rowan, a brand new vendor, an unusually large payment for expedited media services, approved by Claire just minutes before my life imploded. The personal and the professional, two data streams I had always kept meticulously separate, were now converging into a single, ugly point. The blood drained from my face, but my expression remained a perfect, placid mask. My focus narrowed. The world outside of this small, sterile room, outside of the data on my phone screen, ceased to exist. I moved with a strange, deliberate grace, my body acting on autopilot while my mind raced. I reached for the roll of brown paper towels next to the sink, tore off 3 sheets, and knelt down. I methodically wiped up the coffee, my movements precise, efficient. The dark stain came away, leaving only a faint, brownish ghost on the white floor. I picked up the crushed, damp paper cup and dropped it neatly into the recycling bin. Then I stood up, wiped the last of the moisture from the countertop, and glanced at the digital clock on the coffee machine. 5:47 p.m. I made a mental note, a timestamp. Every investigation needs a starting point. Every report begins with a date and time. This was it. The official record of the breach. Evan was still standing there, watching me with a look of profound, almost pathetic, confusion. He had expected tears, shouting, a scene. He had not expected a quiet, efficient cleanup operation. My lack of a predictable, emotional response had clearly thrown him off his script. He had nothing left to say. The deal was done. He turned and walked away without another word. He didn't look back. The only thing he left behind was the cloying scent of a cheap, aggressive cologne he'd started wearing a few months ago. It smelled like ambition and bad decisions. The scent hung in the air, an invasive pollutant in my clean, orderly space. As the automatic doors of the office building sighed shut behind him, a profound silence descended on the break room. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, humming quiet of a server farm after a catastrophic power surge. a silence pregnant with unwritten error logs and the promise of a long, meticulous investigation to come. My investigation. I drove home from the office on autopilot, the rain-slicked streets of Bracken Falls blurring into a meaningless watercolor of neon and gray. The city isn't large. You can drive from the quiet, tree-lined suburbs where Evan and I owned a home to the glass and steel heart of the downtown corporate district in 20 minutes. It's a place built on a comfortable, predictable smallness. But Northway Dynamics is not small. It's a publicly traded entity, a complex ecosystem of international patents, shareholder expectations, and federal regulations. And in that ecosystem, I had built a fortress. My compliance protocols were not suggestions. They were code. They were a network of digital tripwires and procedural choke points, all governed by a single, immutable philosophy. Trust is a liability until verified. My fortress was designed to be impregnable, its gates secured by cryptographic keys and triple redundant approvals. It never occurred to me that the Trojan horse would already be inside my own home. Back in my study, the house unnervingly silent around me, I opened my encrypted link to the Northway servers. The faint hum of my laptop was the only sound. The system alert about Claire's expense approval was still blinking on my screen, a digital beacon in the fog of my personal chaos. I pulled up her employee file, and the memory of her interview, sharp and unwelcome, materialized before me. She had sat across the table from me and the VP of Communications, a vision in tailored navy blue. Her portfolio was a masterpiece of strategic branding, filled with glossy success stories and glowing testimonials. But it wasn't her resume that had snagged my attention. It was her eyes, as the VP waxed lyrical about Northway's culture of innovation. Claire's gaze swept the room with a rapid, almost imperceptible flick. It was the look of a card sharp assessing the table, instantly calculating the odds, identifying the tells, sizing up the weight of every wallet. She wasn't looking for a job. She was scouting a target for acquisition. I'd felt a prickle of professional unease, a faint system warning that I couldn't quite articulate. That night, I had mentioned it to Evan as we cleaned up after dinner. "There's something about her," I'd mused, scrubbing a plate. "She's almost too polished." Evan had laughed, taking the plate from my hands to dry it. "Marin, you're too suspicious," he'd said, his voice laced with that fond, patronizing tone he used when he thought my job was leaking into our real life. "It's what makes you brilliant at what you do. But not everyone is running a scam. Sometimes a person is just good at their job." He had kissed my forehead, a simple gesture that, in retrospect, was not an act of affection, but of misdirection. He was a co-conspirator, calming the guard dog while his partner cased the joint. His words had been a gentle form of gaslighting, designed to make me doubt my own finely honed instincts, and to my eternal shame, I had let them. Now, those instincts were screaming. I navigated to the expense reporting module, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The $25,000 payment was the tip of the iceberg. I filtered for all expenses approved by C. Rowan in the last 90 days, cross-referenced with the new vendor code, 77B PR Blue Fern. The screen populated with a cascade of charges, a river of corporate money flowing into a single, unknown entity. Each one was flagged as urgent or time-sensitive. There were invoices for VIP floral arrangements totaling over $5,000, multiple charges for emergency media room booking at off-site locations, a significant payment for expedited transport of demonstration equipment. The vendor, Blue Fern Collective, had been established in the system just 10 weeks ago. There was no master service agreement on file, no competitive bids, just a torrent of cash, approved with a single click. My blood ran cold. Setting up a new vendor at Northway is a deliberately cumbersome process. It requires a trifecta of approvals, a signature from the requesting department head, one from procurement, and finally, my own signature from compliance. It's a 3-key system, designed to prevent exactly this kind of unchecked spending. I dove deeper into the digital archives, searching for the vendor setup form for Blue Fern. I found it. A scanned PDF dated 3 months prior, the signatures from Claire, as head of PR, and the head of procurement were there. And in the box for the head of compliance was my signature. Except, it wasn't. It was a flawless counterfeit, a high-resolution scan, pasted onto the document with a precision that was almost artistic. Someone had used an old, physical copy of the form, a relic from before I'd migrated the entire process to a secure, digitally signed workflow last year. They had exploited a legacy loophole, creating a ghost entity in our system before the new, armored gates had fully swung shut. How did they get such a clean scan of my signature? My mind churned through server logs, access permissions, employee archives, and then a memory sparked. A stray piece of data I had registered and dismissed weeks ago. It was an automated security email, delivered to my inbox at an ungodly hour. I searched my archives, and there it was, time-stamped 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday 6 weeks ago. The subject line read, "System alert. Password change for inactive account." The account belonged to Mark Renshaw, a graphic designer who had been laid off 8 months ago. His duties had often involved scanning and digitizing old corporate documents for the archives, a vast library that would have included countless papers bearing my physical signature. Someone had reactivated a dead man's account in the middle of the night, gone hunting for my signature, and found it. My next step was reflexive. I ran a new, deep background check on Claire Rowan, this time using the premium investigative tools we reserve for executive-level hires. Her official resume was spotless, but the informal channels, the industry blogs and archived news snippets, told a different story. Her previous employer, Port Lumen Media, was a boutique agency with a quiet reputation for playing fast and loose with billing. I found a trade journal article that alluded to a minor scandal involving inflated invoices and strategic vendor partnerships that funneled money back to Port Lumen executives. No charges were ever filed, but Claire Rowan's name was mentioned as the lead manager on the accounts in question. The pattern was undeniable. She hadn't just brought her glossy portfolio to Northway, she'd brought her entire playbook. The pieces were clicking into place, the professional malfeasance laid bare, but the personal betrayal was a wound that kept weeping. The late nights Evan had been working, the exhausted sighs he'd give when he finally came through the door, claiming he was drowning in specs for the new Latch 9 prototype. It had all been a lie, on a hunch. I opened the PDF invoice from Bluefern Collective and looked at the address. It was a suite in a downtown office building. Then, I logged into our joint credit card account. My eyes scanned the statement history, past the groceries, the gas, the mundane transactions of a shared life, and there they were, a string of charges, once or twice a week for the past 2 months, from a restaurant called the Alderline Event Hall. At the time, Evan had told me they were late-night team dinners, celebrating small milestones on the Latch 9 project. The Alderline Event Hall was on the ground floor of the very same building as the Bluefern Collective. I cross-referenced the dates of the charges with Claire's official PR calendar in the company's shared system. They were perfect matches. Every PR strategy dinner, with an unnamed consultant on her calendar, corresponded to a large dinner bill on my credit card. He hadn't been working. He had been wining and dining his mistress and their fraudulent new business partner, using our money to finance the destruction of our marriage and my company's integrity. A cold, clean fury washed over me, burning away the last vestiges of grief. I was no longer a victim. I was an investigator. I stood up and walked to my printer. With methodical precision, I began printing every piece of evidence: the expense reports with their forged approvals, the scanned vendor form with its counterfeit signature, the server log showing the 2:13 a.m. password change, the background report on Claire Rowan, the credit card statements, with the charges from the Alderline Event Hall highlighted in yellow. Each sheet of paper that slid into the tray was another nail in their coffin. I took a plain, black binder from my shelf. I 3-hole punched each document and clipped it inside, arranging them in chronological order, on the binder's spine. I took a silver marker and wrote in my neat, precise block letters, black, white, no gray. There was no more ambiguity. There were no more shades of interpretation. There was only the evidence. They thought they had left a heartbroken wife crying in the break room. They thought they were smart, that their little scheme was buried under layers of digital paperwork and plausible deniability. What they failed to understand is that I live in those layers. I know every secret corridor, every hidden trapdoor. They see me as the woman they discarded. They have forgotten what I am. I am the architect of the very system they tried to corrupt, and I was now the architect of their reckoning. The black binder lay open on my desk, a stark collection of facts that felt heavier than its physical weight. But facts are only the skeleton. A successful prosecution requires the connective tissue, the irrefutable proof of intent and method. My focus narrowed from the broad strokes of betrayal to the microscopic details of the documents themselves. I began with the master service agreement between Northway Dynamics and the Bluefern Collective. On the surface, it was a passable forgery, crafted from the standard legal template I had personally approved 2 years ago. I read through the boilerplate language, the familiar clauses on liability, confidentiality, and termination. My eyes scanned the text not as a lawyer, but as a forensic typesetter. And then I saw it. It was almost imperceptible, a flaw so minor that 999 out of 1,000 people would never notice. In Section 7, the clause detailing indemnification, the font was wrong. Our corporate standard, mandated for all legal documents, was Calibri, 11 point. This section was Calibri, but it was thinner, sharper. I highlighted the paragraph and checked the font properties. 10.5 point. It was a classic copy and paste error. They had lifted the text from another document, perhaps an old contract from Claire's time at Port Lumen Media, and hadn't bothered to properly match the formatting. It was the digital equivalent of a mismatched thread in a tapestry, a tiny screaming announcement that this document was not authentic. It was a sign of haste, of arrogance. They never imagined someone like me would look this closely. This single error sharpened my senses. I jumped to the contract's execution page, where the signatures were captured. The digital timestamps from DocuSign were present, but beneath them, on the scanned hard copy that had been uploaded to the system, was a physical stamp. Received and processed, NW Accounting. I zoomed in on the date within the stamp's purple ink. It read, August 16th. My internal calendar clicked. August 16th was a Saturday. I knew for an absolute fact that our accounting department is a ghost town on weekends. The office is locked, the lights are off, and the only activity is a cleaning crew that comes in at 6 p.m. No one, least of all the meticulous head of accounts payable, would be in the office on a Saturday to physically stamp a new vendor contract. The stamp was a fraud, a JPEG image likely lifted from another document and digitally superimposed. Sloppy, fatally sloppy. If they were this careless with a vendor contract, what about their own paperwork? My mind turned to Claire. I navigated to the HR portal and pulled up her employee file, specifically her signed non-disclosure agreement. The first 5 pages were standard Northway boilerplate, identical to the hundreds of others I'd reviewed. But then I reached the addenda. Tucked behind the standard clauses for intellectual property and non-competition was a section I had never seen before. Addendum C, Special Media Representation Authority. I read the dense legal jargon, my pulse quickening. The clause granted Claire Rowan, in her capacity as PR manager, the unilateral authority to represent Northway in emerging media markets and special projects without requiring the standard multi-stage approval from the legal and compliance departments. It was a bespoke insertion, a custom-built backdoor into our corporate communications protocol. She had given herself a royal warrant, the power to speak for the entire company with no checks and no balances. This wasn't just an NDA, it was a declaration of sovereignty. The audacity was breathtaking. I toggled back to the Bluefern contract, my eyes now drawn to the payment terms. The clause was practically screaming its own illegality. It stipulated a 60% upfront payment on the total contract value, a figure so far outside of standard procedure it was laughable. Our policy, a policy I had written, was strictly net 30 payment terms upon completion of services. For a brand new, unvetted vendor, a 60% advance was unthinkable. The contract even specified the reason: to ensure timely execution of a time-sensitive launch event, and it dictated the method: payment to be made via corporate credit card, not through our enterprise resource planning system. The ERP was our financial brain, a fortress of purchase orders and invoice matching. Using a credit card was a deliberate, tactical move to bypass every single one of its controls. I dug into the transaction records for the specific card used. It was the primary P card for the Public Relations Department, held under Claire's name. For a transaction of this size, the initial $25,000 payment that had first alerted me, a secondary approval from a designated manager was required. My fingers trembled slightly as I clicked to view the approval log. There, in stark black and white, was the digital signature of the secondary approver: Evan Keats, co-project lead, Latch 9 launch. My breath caught in my throat. It was the final, devastating link. Evan was a brilliant product engineer. He was a lead on the Latch 9 project's technical team, but he held no managerial title in the project's leadership structure. The title, co-project lead, was a complete fabrication, a piece of corporate cosplay designed to sound official enough to fool the automated system. He had leveraged his legitimate, respected position as an engineer to commit financial fraud, approving a massive, non-compliant PR expenditure over which he had absolutely no authority. This wasn't just an affair. This was a conspiracy. The last piece of the puzzle was the contract file itself. I downloaded the PDF to my secure drive and opened the file properties. Clicking on the metadata tab, it was the document's digital soul, a log of its creation and history that most people never even knew existed. The data was stark and unambiguous. Author, Crowan at Northway Dynamics, .com, created, July 28, 10:14 a.m. Last modified, Crowan at Northway Dynamics, .com. And then the final, damning entry. Last printed, Evank, Northway Dynamics, .com. Last printed, September 24th, 1:02 a.m. 1 in the morning, I pictured him there, alone in the fluorescent glare of the empty 14th floor, the city dark outside the window. He was the one who had printed the document Claire created. He was the one who had likely applied the fake accounting stamp and obtained the scanned signature. He was the logistics man, the inside agent, using his late-night work habits as a cover for his crimes. The image was so clear, so painfully vivid, it felt like a memory of my own. It was time to move the evidence off the network. I methodically began to transfer every file to a military-grade encrypted USB drive, the Blue Fern contract with its mismatched font, the screenshot of the fake Saturday stamp, Claire's custom-built NDA, the credit card transaction logs with Evan's fraudulent approval, the damning PDF metadata. I dragged each file into a single folder on the thumb drive. I named the folder Whistle Aegis. My alert system had been the shield. This would be the spear. This collection of data was now completely offline, air-gapped, and under my sole control, my insurance policy. With the evidence secured, I took the next step. I used a prepaid burner phone I kept for emergencies to dial the Northway Corporate Ethics Hotline. It was an external service, run by a third party in another state, a system I had fought for years to implement. A robotic voice answered. When prompted, I began to speak, my own voice altered by the cheap phone, sounding clipped, calm, and anonymous. I am reporting a credible suspicion of high-level internal collusion and fraudulent vendor activity, I stated, my words precise. The scheme involves the Public Relations Department, specifically its head, Claire Rowan, and a product engineer, Evan Keats. A fraudulent vendor named Blue Fern Collective has been established, bypassing standard financial controls. Review all PRP card transactions and vendor setups from the last 90 days. The corruption is significant. I provided the vendor name and the date of the first transaction, then ended the call. The seed was planted in fertile ground. The official mechanism of the company would now begin to turn, slowly but unstoppably. My work for the night was done. I sat in the silent house, the whistle Aegis drive warm in my hand. My personal phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Evan. "Marin, where are you? We need to talk about this." I looked at the screen, at his name, and felt nothing but a cold, clean distance. We had nothing to talk about. He wanted to manage the emotional fallout, to negotiate the terms of my surrender. He didn't realize that I was no longer on that battlefield. I had moved the war to a terrain of metadata, compliance statutes, and board-level accountability, a terrain where I was the reigning sovereign. I set the phone face down. My silence was no longer the silence of a wounded wife. It was the strategic quiet of a predator, waiting patiently in the tall grass, giving its prey all the time in the world to wander deeper into the trap. The following Wednesday, Evan sent me a text. He had been staying at a corporate apartment downtown, our communication limited to curt, logistical exchanges about mail and bills. This one was different, an attempt at a semblance of normalcy. "Have to fly out to Halcyon Ridge tomorrow. Last-minute supplier summit for Latch 9. Should be back Sunday." Halcyon Ridge was a sleepy resort town in the mountains, a place for corporate retreats and golf. It sounded plausible, but the name Latch 9 snagged on the fine mesh of my suspicion. It was the same project he had used as a cover for his dinners with Claire, on my work system. I pulled up Claire's shared calendar, which was, as always, meticulously updated. Her entire block from Thursday to Saturday was marked out with a single, opaque entry. Private PR influencer and media event, confidential. The location was listed only as off-site. The coincidence was too blatant, too clumsy. They were getting sloppy. That evening, a thought struck me. In the back of the closet in my home office was a relic of our former life, an old family iPad, long since replaced, that we used to use for recipes and travel. Evan had never bothered to wipe it or unlink his accounts. I pulled it out, blew a layer of dust from the screen, and plugged it in. The device sputtered to life. I opened the Find My app. A map of the state bloomed on the screen, a small, pulsing dot representing my phone in Bracken Falls. I searched for Evan's devices. His phone was turned off, as expected, but his AirPods, which I knew he always carried, were active. The map zoomed, and my breath hitched. The location pin wasn't in the mountains. It wasn't anywhere near Halcyon Ridge. It was pulsing steadily in the heart of downtown Bracken Falls. I zoomed in further, the street grids becoming clearer. The pin was dropped with chilling precision on the roof of a familiar building, the Alderline Event Hall. My heart was hammering, a cold, clinical rhythm. This wasn't just a lie. It was an active operation. I needed more, acting on a hunch. I opened Instagram on a burner account I kept for monitoring industry trends. I navigated to Claire's profile. She had just posted a new story. It was a picture of a perfectly manicured hand, her hand, holding a crystal glass of ruby red wine. The caption was a masterpiece of corporate smugness. "To the future, big things are happening. At Northway Nashgar Innovation/PR Life." It was a photo designed to evoke envy and curiosity, but I wasn't looking at the wine or the caption. I was looking at the reflection, distorted in the round curve of the wine glass. It took me a second to resolve the warped image, but then I saw it, unmistakable and damning. Reflected in the glass was a large banner, and on it, the sharp, angular lines of the Northway Dynamics logo. I was in my car in 5 minutes. The drive to the Alderline was a blur of traffic lights and rain-streaked asphalt. I didn't go to the main entrance. Instead, I circled into the adjacent multi-story car park, taking a ticket and driving up to the 3rd level, which gave me a clear, discreet view of the event hall's valet circle. The lot was filled with Blacktown cars and high-end SUVs. One of them, a gleaming black Escalade with rental plates, caught my eye. It looked exactly like the kind of vehicle our corporate travel policy approved for transporting VIPs. I zoomed in with my phone's camera, taking a clear, high-resolution shot of the license plate. I ran the plate through a public records database I had professional access to. The result came back in under a minute. The vehicle was registered to a corporate fleet service, and the rental agreement? It was under Northway Dynamics, authorized by one Claire Rowan. It was time to go inside. I walked across the street, my black raincoat blending in with the evening shadows. I bypassed the main entrance, where two guards were checking a list on an iPad. I knew this building. I'd attended a charity gala here 2 years ago. I walked confidently around the side to a service entrance I remembered, pulled the handle, and found it unlocked. I slipped into a quiet, carpeted hallway. Muffled music and the low din of a crowd were audible through a set of heavy double doors. I pushed one open just enough to peer through. The sight that greeted me was so brazen it almost made me laugh. The ballroom was bathed in Northway's signature blue light. On a large stage at the far end of the room hung a massive banner that read, "The Future, Unveiled, the Northway Latch 9. It was a full-blown, unauthorized, preemptive product launch for our company's most secret and valuable upcoming device, and there, on the stage, bathed in a spotlight, was my husband. Evan was holding a sleek, metallic prototype, speaking with an engineer's passion about its revolutionary gyroscopic locking mechanism. To his left, at a transparent lectern, stood Claire, dressed in a sharp white pantsuit, reading what was clearly a press release to the rapt audience of tech journalists and industry influencers. In the corner, a small, two-man camera crew was filming, a small logo for the Blue Fern Collective, glowing on their monitor. They were live-streaming the theft of millions of dollars of intellectual property in real time. I slipped into the darkened room and found an empty chair at a table in the very back. My phone was already out, its camera recording, the red light taped over. I panned slowly, capturing the stage, the banner, the crowd. I wanted faces. I wanted proof of who was in this room, who was complicit. On the large screens flanking the stage, a QR code was displayed. "Scan for exclusive updates and press materials," it urged. I opened my QR scanner and pointed it at the screen. The link resolved. It wasn't a https:/google.com/search QQuas Northway Dynamics com address. It was a hastily constructed landing page with a domain name. https google.com/search QQuas Latch 9 future com. I ran a quick UHOIs search on the domain. Registered 2 weeks ago. Registrar. Panama. Registrant information. Redacted for privacy. They were harvesting the contact information of the entire tech press corps on an untraceable, unsecured, offshore server. The sheer, multi-layered audacity of the fraud was breathtaking. The presentation wound down. Claire stepped up to the lectern. "We have time for a few questions," she said, her voice smooth as silk. A few hands went up. The questions were softballs about battery life and market positioning. After the third one, I stood up. The room was dark, and I was just a silhouette to them on the brightly lit stage. "A question for Ms. Rowan," I said. My voice, unamplified, was still clear and steady in the suddenly quiet room. "Northway's corporate policy, Section 11.3b, on the disclosure of material non-public information, requires a full legal and compliance review before any prototype or forward-looking statements are released to the public. Could you clarify which legal officer signed off on this event?" Claire squinted, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face as she tried to place the anonymous, challenging voice. She couldn't see me clearly, and her confidence was absolute. She smiled, a dazzling, dismissive flash of white teeth. It was the smile of a predator that knows it has already won. "Thank you for your diligence," she purred into the microphone, her tone dripping with condescension. "I can assure you, all necessary internal approvals were secured for this strategic initiative." I took one step forward, moving just enough for the ambient light from the stage to catch my face. I saw the exact moment they recognized me. Evan's hand, the one holding the prototype, began to tremble. His face went slack with a look of pure, abject horror. Claire's smile didn't vanish, but it froze, a brittle, plastic mask. My voice, when I spoke again, was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the ballroom. It was the coldest sound in the world. Were they secured by the same authority that approved the vendor contract for Blue Fern Collective? I paused, letting the implication hang in the dead air. Because my records show the only authorizing signature for that entity belongs to a user account that was permanently deactivated 8 months ago. Absolute, profound silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. In that moment, the entire room, the entire conspiracy, was frozen in the spotlight with them, exposed, indefensible, and utterly, utterly screwed. I didn't go home after the Alderline event. I went directly to my office. While the city slept, I worked under the quiet hum of the server room, fueled by a cold, clear purpose. The adrenaline from the confrontation had burned away, leaving behind only the task at hand. I took the raw data from my Whistle Aegis drive and methodically compiled it into a formal 38-page report. It was the driest, most dispassionate document I have ever written. There was no mention of betrayal, no hint of a personal connection. It was a sterile presentation of facts, a clinical autopsy of a corporate crime. Appendix A contained the fraudulent invoices from Blue Fern Collective. Appendix B, the server access log showing the 2 a.m. password change. Appendix C was a detailed analysis of the contract's forged signatures and metadata. Appendix D cross-referenced Evan's fraudulent expense approvals with Claire's PR calendar and our joint credit card statements. The final appendix was a high-resolution video file of the illegal Latch 9 launch event. At 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, I submitted it via Northway's encrypted whistleblower portal, which I knew would deliver it simultaneously to the personal inboxes of our general counsel and the 3 independent directors who comprised the audit committee. Then I went home, showered, and slept for 4 hours. The summons arrived at 6:02 a.m. on Monday morning. It was an email from Arthur Vance, our general counsel, a man who used words as sparingly as a miser spends gold. The subject line was simply, "Urgent." The body of the email was even more concise. Ms. Keats, my office, 7:00 a.m., attendance is mandatory. There were only 4 other names on the invitation: our CEO, our CFO, and Marcus Thorne, the formidable chairman of the board. The names Claire Rowan and Evan Keats were conspicuously absent. The machine was beginning to move. I walked into the executive boardroom at 6:58 a.m. The air was thick with a tension that the panoramic view of Bracken Falls could not dissipate. The 4 of them were already there, seated around the polished mahogany table, copies of my report printed and bound before them. They looked like men who had not slept. I took the empty seat at the foot of the table, placed my laptop down, and waited. "Marin," Marcus Thorne began, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "Walk us through this." I connected my laptop to the room's projector and began. My voice was even, my presentation clinical. I moved from the initial vendor setup to the forged signatures, the custom NDA, the illicit product launch. When I put the slide on the screen detailing the 60% advance payment to Blue Fern, the $25,000 P-card transaction, deliberately routed around our ERP system, I saw Eleanor Vance, our CFO, physically flinch. A woman who stared down Wall Street analysts without blinking went visibly pale. To her, this wasn't just a policy violation, it was a desecration, a violation of the fundamental sanctity of her financial controls. She made a small, sharp note on her copy of the report, her pen digging into the paper. The climax of my presentation was a single, stark slide. On the left side of the screen, I displayed the screenshot of the Blue Fern contract's PDF metadata. Author, C. Rowan, last printed by Evan Keats, at 1:02 a.m., on the right side. I projected the security access log for the 14th floor on the corresponding date. A single line was highlighted in red. Access granted. Keats, Evan. Location, Engineering Wing entrance. Time, 1:01:47 a.m. A heavy silence descended on the room. The two pieces of evidence hovered on the screen. A perfect, inescapable digital circuit. There was no room for doubt, no possibility of coincidence. It was the ghost in the machine, captured and pinned under glass. Finally, the chairman spoke, his eyes fixed on me. "The evidence of collusion and fraud is compelling," he said, the understatement hanging in the air. "But the question remains, motive?" I advanced to my final slide. It was almost entirely blank, containing only 2 bullet points in the center of the vast white space. Primary motive: conflict of interest, an undisclosed, romantic relationship between the principals, Ms. Rowan and Mr. Keats, creating a severe ethical and professional breach. Secondary motive: illicit financial gain. The vendor entity, Bluefern Collective, is structured in a way that strongly suggests the potential for financial kickbacks to the principals. I used the precise, sterile language of a corporate investigation. I did not say affair. The term undisclosed romantic relationship was colder, sharper, and in this context, infinitely more damning. The reaction was not a debate. It was an execution. Marcus Thorne looked at Arthur Vance. "Arthur, freeze any and all pending payments to this Bluefern entity, effective immediately." He then turned to our CFO. "Eleanor, I want an independent forensic accounting firm retained and on-site by noon today. I want to know where every single dollar went." Finally, he looked at our CEO. "John, suspend all corporate network access, email, and building privileges for Ms. Rowan and Mr. Keats. Right now. Have security accompany them off the premises if necessary. No exceptions." The directives were issued with the calm, brutal efficiency of a military command. In less than 60 seconds, the corporate lives of Claire Rowan and Evan Keats had been terminated. As the meeting adjourned and the executives filed out, their faces grim, Linda Gross, our head of HR, gently touched my arm. She had been called in for the final 5 minutes to receive her instructions. Her expression was a complex mixture of professional shock and personal sympathy. "Marin," she said, her voice low, "given the personal dimension of this situation, the company would fully support you if you chose to take a paid leave of absence, for your own protection and your well-being. No one would question it." I looked at her, a woman I respected, and offered a small, firm shake of my head. "Thank you, Linda, but that won't be necessary. My well-being is best served by ensuring the integrity of this process from start to finish. I want to be at my desk." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. I was not the victim here. I was not a woman in need of shelter from the storm. I was the storm's navigational system. I walked out of the boardroom and down the hushed, carpeted hallway of the executive wing. The building was beginning to come to life, the murmur of the workday starting. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. A new message from Evan. He must have just received the notification that his network access had been revoked. The message was 4 simple, panicked words. "What have you done?" I stared at the screen, at the question from a man who still, even now, could only see my actions through the lens of a scorned wife. He was asking the wrong question. It wasn't about what I had done. It was about what he had done. I felt no anger, no sadness, only the quiet, final click of a lock falling into place. I didn't reply. I slid the phone back into my pocket, the screen dark, the right to remain silent. I thought, is not just a legal principle, it's a corporate strategy, and my silence was the most eloquent answer I could possibly give. He came that night. I was in the living room of what was once our home, the black binder of evidence open on the coffee table, when I heard a key scrape violently in the lock. The door flew open and slammed against the wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet house. Evan stood in the doorway, his face a contorted mask of fury and disbelief. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out and filled with hornets. His tie was askew, his hair disheveled. He was no longer the calm, collected engineer. He was a cornered animal. "You," he spat, his voice a ragged tear in the silence. He strode into the room, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. "You ruined my career. Everything. It's all gone because of you." I didn't stand up. I remained seated on the sofa, my posture calm, my hands resting on the open binder. I looked up at him, my gaze level and cool. "No, Evan," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the unyielding weight of fact. "You ruined your career. I just documented it, and you were the one who signed." The simple, undeniable truth seemed to enrage him further. He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Signed? I didn't know what I was signing. Claire said it was just standard procedure to expedite things. She said you wouldn't understand, that you were always bottling things up in red tape." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the key to the house, my house now, and threw it onto the coffee table. It skittered across the polished wood and came to rest on top of a highlighted invoice. "She told me this would happen. She said you were jealous, that you couldn't stand to see me happy, so you'd invent some compliance fantasy to destroy us." He was panting, his chest heaving, his entire argument a desperate, pathetic recitation of another woman's script. He was trying to cast me in a role. The scorned wife, the hysterical woman. It was a role I refused to play. Slowly, deliberately. I closed the binder. I reached into my laptop bag, which sat beside me, and retrieved the Whistle Aegis USB drive. It was small and black, an insignificant piece of plastic that held the digital ruin of his life. I placed it on the table next to his discarded key. "This isn't a fantasy, Evan," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I tapped the USB drive with my index finger. "This is a high-definition video of you on stage at the Alderline Event Hall, presenting a proprietary, unannounced Northway prototype to a room full of journalists in a clear violation of SEC regulations." I tapped it again. "This is the contract with Blue Fern Collective, created by Claire and printed by you at 1:02 in the morning from a terminal on the 14th floor." Another tap. "This is the fabricated secondary approval you gave for a $25,000 wire transfer, using a job title you do not possess." I leaned forward slightly. My eyes locked on his. "And this is the internal financial model the forensic accountants found on Claire's cloud drive, the one that shows a 30% kickback from all Blue Fern invoices, paid into a shell corporation registered in Delaware, a shell corporation for which you are listed as a minority partner." The color drained from his face. It happened so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug at the base of his neck. The rage, the bluster, the second-hand accusations, it all evaporated, leaving behind a raw, primal fear. He stared at the small black rectangle on the table as if it were a bomb. He finally looked at me, and for the first time since this began, he saw me not as his wife, but as what I am. He saw the architect of the system he had tried to game. What do you want?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I leaned back, the sofa sighing softly beneath me. My demand was simple, my terms absolute. "The truth," I said, "the complete, unvarnished, documented truth, and then my freedom." He sank onto the armchair opposite me, his body folding in on itself. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The confession, when it came, was not a defiant roar but a pathetic, whimpering flood. It all came out, a torrent of weakness, ambition, and greed. Claire's grand plan. She had convinced him that the official Latch 9 launch was too slow, too bogged down in corporate bureaucracy. She had a vision for a disruptive guerrilla launch that would make them both legends at the company. She told him they'd be heroes, the mavericks who got things done. She had the vendor, Blue Fern, a trusted partner from her old firm. It was just her and a couple of freelancers, but she presented it as a powerhouse agency. The plan was to bill Northway for a full-scale media campaign, use a fraction of the money to put on the single showcase event, and pocket the difference. The 30% kickback was their nest egg, the start of their new life together. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. I just thought it was cutting a few corners to get ahead. She made it sound so smart, so strategic. You never thought you'd get caught, I finished for him, my voice like ice. I had no sympathy for him. His ambition had been a weapon for her to wield, and he had aimed it squarely at my back. I reached into my bag again and pulled out a slim, stapled document. It was a printed copy of the Northway Dynamics Global Code of Conduct. I opened it to a page marked with a red tab and slid it across the table to him. "Read that," I commanded. Section 12. Conduct and Consequences. His eyes scanned the page, his expression turning from fear to utter despair. I knew the words by heart. Any employee found to have engaged in willful financial misrepresentation, conspiracy to defraud the company, or gross violation of conflict of interest policies will be subject to immediate termination for cause. I let him read the next line, the one that truly mattered. Termination for cause will result in the immediate and permanent forfeiture of all unvested stock options and restricted stock units. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He had over 5 years of stock options, a golden parachute worth a small fortune that was due to fully vest in 18 months. With a single stroke, it would all be gone. "You have a choice, Evan," I said. Standing up, I was done. The confrontation was over. The negotiation had begun. "You have 12 hours. By 9 a.m. tomorrow. The General Counsel will have on his desk a full, signed confession from you, a complete, detailed narrative of your involvement, Claire's involvement, and the mechanics of the Blue Fern scheme. You will hold nothing back. You will cooperate fully with the internal investigation." He stared at me, uncomprehending. "And if I do?" "If you do," I said, walking towards the door, "this remains an internal HR matter. You will be fired, you will lose your stock, and you will walk away with whatever is in your 401k. It will be a corporate execution, clean, quiet, and final." "And if I don't?" he whispered. I paused at the door, my hand on the knob, and looked back at him, a man drowning in the ruins of the life he had torched. "If you don't," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation, "then at 9:01 a.m., this USB drive and my complete, unredacted report will be hand-delivered to the White-Collar Crime Division of the District Attorney's Office, and this will cease to be an HR matter and become a criminal one." I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, pulling it shut behind me. I didn't slam it. I closed it softly, the latch clicking into place with a quiet, definitive finality. I left him in there, in the silent living room, with his discarded key, the damning evidence, and the frantic, terrified drumming of his own heart. A mouse trapped in a maze of his own making. Evan's confession. A 16-page, single-spaced document detailing the entire Blue Fern conspiracy was on the General Counsel's desk by 8:30 a.m. the next morning. The corporate gears turned with swift, merciless efficiency. But the professional battle was only one front in this war. The second, the dissolution of my marriage, required a different set of protocols. 3 years ago, in the sterile conference room of a family law attorney, I had signed our prenuptial agreement. I remember the weight of the pen, the crispness of the paper. To me, it was a logical step, an emotional risk management strategy no different from the corporate policies I drafted every day. Evan had laughed. He treated the whole affair with a kind of bemused disdain, as if I were being adorably, unnecessarily pragmatic. "This is meaningless, Marin," he'd said, signing his name with a flourish. "We're not the kind of people who need this. It's just paper." He was wrong. It wasn't just paper. It was a contract. And I had drafted one particular clause myself, a custom addendum that the lawyer had called unusually specific. It was Clause 14. It stated, in precise, unambiguous legal language, that in the event of a divorce, the standard 50-50 division of marital assets would be rendered void if it could be proven that one party had, through malicious or negligent action, caused significant and material harm to the other party's professional standing, career trajectory, or reputation within their field. In such an event, The division of assets would shift to a 90-10 split, in favor of the professionally injured party. Evan had barely skimmed it, his mind already on the dinner reservations he'd made to celebrate our impending nuptials. I, on the other hand, had committed it to memory. The anonymous ethics complaint and the subsequent investigation had protected my reputation at Northway, but the ground was still shifting beneath my feet. I knew that Claire and Evan, in their desperation, would try to paint me as a woman motivated by personal vengeance rather than professional duty. I needed to prove that their actions had already created a hostile environment, that the damage had already begun. It didn't take me long to find the proof. I searched my email archives for any communications from Claire that had been sent to a wide audience, and there it was. An email chain from 2 weeks ago, with the subject line, Latch 9 Project Timeline. It was a discussion between Claire, Evan, and a few senior marketing managers. My name was mentioned in relation to a compliance hold I had placed on some of their proposed marketing copy, which contained unverified performance claims. Buried deep in the chain was a reply from Claire, addressed to the group, but it wasn't sent just to the group. She had, with what could only be described as surgical malice, accidentally copied a company-wide distribution list named All Staff Announcements. Her email read, "Team, let's be mindful of the pushback from compliance on this. Marin is an expert in her field, but she can be exceptionally rigid. I understand she is dealing with some significant personal challenges at the moment that may be affecting her perspective. Let's try to exercise patience and empathy as we navigate this." It was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. In 2 seemingly innocuous sentences, she had painted me as emotionally unstable, professionally compromised, and difficult, all under the guise of compassion. It was a poison dart wrapped in velvet. It was a direct, calculated attack on my professional reputation. It was a clear and prosecutable case of workplace harassment, and it was the trigger for Clause 14. I booked an appointment with the best divorce attorney in Bracken Falls, a woman named Avery Locke, whose reputation was as sharp and unyielding as her name. I didn't walk into her office with tears and stories of a broken heart. I walked in with my black binder. I laid out the evidence, the email from Claire, the fraudulent invoices signed by Evan, the timeline of the affair cross-referenced with the financial conspiracy. I showed her the prenuptial agreement, with Clause 14 highlighted. Avery, a woman with piercing blue eyes and an air of perpetual impatience, reviewed the documents in silence. She read Clause 14 twice, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. When she finally looked up from the binder, she closed it with a soft, final thud. Her assessment was brief and to the point. "We won't be needing a courtroom for this, Ms. Keats," she said. "This isn't a negotiation. It's a surrender." Our strategy was simple. We would offer Evan a one-time settlement. It was not a request for alimony or a complex division of assets. It was a clean, surgical amputation. He would sign over his 50% marital stake in the house, the car, and our joint savings and investment accounts. He would walk away with his personal effects and his 401k, nothing more, in return for his immediate and uncontested agreement. I would sign a document affirming my decision not to pursue the matter with the district attorney's office. The threat of criminal prosecution, which I had held over him to secure his confession to the company, would now be leveraged to secure my freedom. Avery sent the offer to Evan's newly retained lawyer. The response was a predictable mix of outrage and disbelief. Evan refused to even consider it. He claimed it was punitive, that I was using the corporate situation to bleed him dry. For 2 days. A stalemate ensued. I knew he was hesitating, holding on to the faint, foolish hope that he could somehow salvage a piece of the life he had set on fire. I also knew he was running out of time. The tipping point arrived via a text message. On Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Evan, a screenshot of an email he had just received from Northway's HR department. The subject line was cold and official. "Update on your employment status." The body of the email informed him that, following the initial findings of the internal investigation, his unpaid suspension was being converted to a formal administrative leave pending a final hearing on termination for cause. The corporate guillotine was being sharpened. The theoretical loss of his career and his stock options was suddenly, terrifyingly real. He was cornered. He was about to lose everything. My offer was no longer a punishment. It was a lifeline. The only path that didn't end in a courtroom. That evening, as if on cue, my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. It was Claire. "You are destroying my life," the message read. There was no punctuation, just the raw, impotent rage of a queen whose chessboard had been flipped over. I looked at the words on the screen. There was a time they might have hurt me, might have made me feel a flicker of guilt, but I felt nothing. I was no longer a participant in her drama. I was an observer, a record keeper. I typed a short, simple reply, my thumbs moving with detached precision. "You did that yourself. I just turned on the lights." I sent the message and blocked her number. Evan's lawyer called Avery an hour later. He accepted the settlement. The signing was scheduled for that night at Avery's deserted office. A notary was present. The air in the conference room was cold and still. Evan sat across the table from me, a ghost of the man I had married. He was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He didn't look at me. He looked at the papers, at the long, dense paragraphs that were legally dismantling our shared existence. When the notary slid the final signature page in front of him, he picked up the pen, and I saw that his hand was trembling violently. His signature, once a confident, flowing script, was a jagged, spidery scrawl. He pushed the papers back across the table and stood up, a broken man with nothing left to say. He walked out without a word. The notary affixed her seal with a heavy, satisfying stamp. 9:12 p.m. It was done. Back at my house, solely and completely, I took the executed original of our settlement agreement and the prenuptial agreement that had made it possible. I walked to the small, fireproof safe in my study and spun the combination dial. The heavy door swung open. I placed the documents inside, next to my passport and other essential papers. As I closed the door, the steel tumblers of the lock slid into place with a dry metallic click. It wasn't the sound of a door closing. It was the sound of a cage opening. It was the sound of freedom. It was exactly 1 week to the minute since Evan had detonated my life by the coffee machine. Friday morning, an email had gone out to all Northway employees at 8:15 a.m., its subject line a stark, imperative command. Mandatory all-hands meeting, 10:02 a.m., auditorium. The corporate grapevine, already buzzing with rumors of locked accounts and hushed meetings in the executive wing, went into overdrive. The air in the office was electric with speculation. I walked into the auditorium at 9:55 a.m. I didn't take a seat down front with the other department heads. Instead, I made my way to the back, standing against the wall in the section usually occupied by the product engineers, Evan's people. I wanted to see everything. I needed to be a face in the crowd, anonymous, observing the shockwave from its epicenter. The room was packed, a sea of anxious faces, the low murmur of 1,000 whispered conversations filling the vast space. At precisely 10:02 a.m., the lights dimmed. The chatter died instantly. A single spotlight hit the stage, illuminating 3 figures seated in stark, leather armchairs: Jonathan Pierce, our CEO, to his left, Arthur Vance, the general counsel, and to his right, Marcus Thorne, the chairman of the board, the Holy Trinity. There was no cheerful PR backdrop, no upbeat corporate music. This was not a celebration. It was a tribunal. Jonathan Pierce, a man who typically exuded a kind of avuncular tech CEO charm, stood and walked to the lectern. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. The silence in the room was absolute, a held breath. "Good morning," he began, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "We've called this meeting to address a serious internal matter. Over the past week, the board's audit committee, with the help of external counsel and forensic accountants, has conducted an accelerated and thorough investigation into a significant breach of our company's code of conduct, financial protocols, and information disclosure policies." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. This was far bigger than anyone had imagined. The investigation has confirmed a coordinated effort to defraud the company, misappropriate corporate assets, and violate SEC regulations through the unauthorized disclosure of proprietary information. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His eyes swept the room, cold and hard. As a result of these findings, the following actions have been taken. He took a breath, and the world seemed to slow down. This was the moment, the blade falling. Effective immediately, Claire Rowan's employment with Northway Dynamics has been terminated, for cause. A collective gasp, sharp and audible, swept across the auditorium. Claire, the untouchable, rising star, fired. Furthermore, Pierce continued, his voice like stone, a formal disciplinary hearing is pending for product engineer Evan Keats. Based on his role in these violations, his employment status is under final review by the board. I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the stage, but my senses were tuned to the crowd around me. I saw the faces of Evan's colleagues, the men and women he worked with every day. Their expressions were a kaleidoscope of disbelief, shock, and a dawning, horrified understanding. They were looking at each other, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. I felt a few glances flicker in my direction, the few who knew of our separation, now connecting the dots in real time. I kept my own expression perfectly neutral, my gaze locked forward. I was a stone in the river, letting the current of their shock wash over me. Then, Pierce did something unexpected. He softened his tone, just slightly, and leaned into the microphone. I want to be clear about one other thing. This entire scheme was brought to light by a single employee, a person who, faced with a complex and difficult situation, chose to trust our systems and our principles. They did not gossip. They did not leak. They followed our ethics protocol to the letter and delivered a clear, fact-based report directly to the audit committee. The integrity and courage of this individual has, without exaggeration, saved this company from a catastrophic public scandal and significant shareholder value destruction. We will not be naming this person, but on behalf of the entire board, I want to extend our profound and eternal gratitude. In the row in front of me, a young engineer whispered to his neighbor, his voice filled with awe. "Damn, who do you think did it?" His friend just shook his head. Speechless, I remained silent, my heart a steady, even drumbeat in my chest. My vindication was not in the applause of the crowd, but in the quiet, unassailable truth of the chairman's words. As if scripted by a filmmaker with a flair for the dramatic. A commotion started at the main entrance to the auditorium. I glanced at the large monitor by the wall, which showed a live feed from the lobby security camera, and there she was, Claire Rowan, dressed in a defiant, blood-red dress, was striding towards the doors, her phone to her ear. She was clearly late, oblivious, walking into what she must have assumed was a standard-issue company meeting. 2 uniformed security guards stepped in front of her, blocking her path. The camera zoomed in. I watched, along with 100 others who had noticed the monitor. As the guards spoke to her, her face registered confusion, then indignation, then dawning horror. One of the guards gestured to her employee ID, clipped to her designer handbag. I saw her hands, her perfectly manicured nails trembling. As she fumbled to unclip the badge, she handed it over. The doors to her kingdom were now permanently closed. She turned, her face a mask of incandescent fury, and stormed away, out of the camera's view and out of our lives. My eyes scanned the crowd, searching for, and finding, the one other person whose world had just been publicly dismantled. Evan was there, sitting alone near the aisle in the middle of the room. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was staring at the floor, at the toes of his shoes, as if they held the secrets to the universe. He was physically smaller, shrunken, a man consumed by the gravity of his own failure. For a brief, flickering moment, he lifted his head, his gaze sweeping blankly across the back of the room. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. There was no anger in his look, no accusation, only a vast, empty, horrifying recognition. He looked like a man who had spent a week digging a deep hole and had only just realized he was standing at the bottom of it. He looked away, back at the floor. As the CEO wrapped up his remarks, members of his staff began moving through the aisles, handing out a single-sheet memo. A copy was passed to me. It was an immediate directive from the CFO and General Counsel. All corporate P-cards assigned to the PR and marketing departments were to be immediately recalled and reissued. All PR vendor contracts were now under a mandatory 90-day review. A list of unapproved third-party domains, including HTTPS, Google.com, search, Latch9 Future.com, were now permanently blocked by the company firewall. It was the physical aftermath, the cleanup operation. Every loophole they had exploited was being sealed, one by one, with concrete and steel. I let my gaze drift to the front rows, to the section reserved for senior management. There was an empty chair there, third from the aisle, Claire's chair, from the back of the room. It was just an empty space, but I could imagine it so clearly. I could almost smell the faint, lingering scent of her expensive, aggressive perfume. A ghost of an ambition that had burned so brightly and then, in an instant, had been extinguished. "We are a company built on innovation," Pierce said from the stage, his voice finally regaining some of its familiar strength. "But innovation without integrity is just a faster way to fail. Today we reset. We reaffirm our commitment to our principles. We're going back to doing the right thing." And then, a strange thing happened. It started with one person, then another, a slow, hesitant smattering of applause that grew, swelling into a wave of sound that filled the entire auditorium. They weren't clapping for the drama or for the firings. They were clapping for the simple, clear, resonant idea of a company choosing to correct its course. It was the sound of relief. It was the sound of order being restored. I stood there, amidst the thunderous noise, and I didn't clap. I simply listened. The applause from the town hall faded as the day wore on, replaced by the quiet, industrious hum of a company trying to find its footing again. The shock had given way to a focused, almost grim determination. Memos were actioned, security protocols were updated, and the names Rowan and Keats were spoken only in hushed, careful whispers. I remained at my desk, a point of stillness in the swirling currents of consequence. I wasn't celebrating. I was closing out the file. There were still loose threads, personal ones, that required the same methodical, dispassionate attention as a corporate audit. Late in the afternoon, my inbox pinged. It was a sound I heard 100 times a day, but this one landed with a different weight. The sender was Evan. The subject line was a single, desperate word: please. I opened it. The email was a rambling, disjointed plea, the digital equivalent of a man on his knees. He wrote about the 12 years we had shared, about the house we had built, about the memories that he couldn't reconcile with the man he saw on the internal security footage being escorted from the building. He didn't apologize for the affair. Not really. He called it a terrible mistake, a moment of insanity. He didn't acknowledge the fraud. He referred to it as getting in over my head with Claire's project. He was not a man confessing his sins. He was a man trying to reframe the narrative of his own damnation. He ended the email with a single, pleading question. "Can we just talk? Please, Marin, just one conversation. I have to believe there is something left for us to salvage." I read his words, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, not even the ghost of a heartbreak. It was like reading a poorly written legal argument from an opposing counsel, full of emotional appeals but utterly devoid of fact. He was still searching for a loophole, a clause that would allow him to renegotiate the terms of his own reality. He believed there was still a something, a shared emotional asset that he could leverage. It was my job to inform him that this asset had been fully depreciated. My fingers moved over the keyboard. My reply was not born of rage or passion. It was a statement of account, a final closing balance. I did not engage with his memories or his revisionist history. I dealt only in the present. in the cold, hard currency of consequence. Evan, I wrote, you are mistaken. There is no something left for us to salvage. There is only a process left to conclude, and we will conclude it correctly. My words were the foundation. Now, for the supporting documentation. I clicked the paperclip icon. I attached 2 files from the secure drive on my desktop. The first was a PDF copy of the fully executed and notarized divorce settlement, the one he had signed with a trembling hand in my lawyer's office. Its file name was Cold and Clinical, Keats M. Keats E-Marital Settlement Agreement Final. PDF. The second was a carbon copy of the email I had received from the General Counsel's office an hour earlier, formally acknowledging receipt of his 16-page confession. Its subject line was simple: confirmation of receipt. E. Keats' written statement. These attachments were not arguments. They were facts. They were the legally binding bookends of our story. He was trying to reopen a conversation I had already, definitively, closed. Before I sent it, I added one final paragraph. It felt necessary, not for him, but for me. It was the final, clarifying entry in the logbook. You came to me in the break room and you said, "It's over. I'm with Claire." Your words were the start of this process. I have simply completed the work you began. I took your statement and finished the sentence. It's over. And I'm with myself. I read the entire email one last time. It was precise. It was irrefutable. It was final. I moved my cursor over the blue send button. I clicked it. The email vanished from my screen. The small undo send option appeared for a few seconds in the corner, and then it, too, was gone. There was no undoing this. The last thread had been cut. I swiveled in my chair and looked down at my left hand. My wedding ring felt alien, a foreign object I'd been carrying for too long. It was a perfect, platinum circle, a symbol of a promise that had been revealed as nothing more than a temporary contract with hidden exit clauses. I slowly, deliberately, worked it off my finger. It slid past my knuckle with a final, stubborn resistance, and then it was free. I held it in the palm of my hand. It was just a piece of metal, cold and heavy, stripped of all its former power. I found a small, padded courier envelope in my desk drawer. I dropped the ring inside. It made a soft, muffled sound. I sealed the envelope and, with my black felt-tip pen, wrote his name and the address of his temporary corporate apartment on the front in my neatest block lettering. I called the dispatch service and arranged for a pickup. An hour later, a courier came to my desk, and I handed him the small package. The last piece of our shared physical world was now in transit, an artifact being returned to the archivist. That evening, I did not stay late at the office. I went home. The house was quiet, the air still. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a presence. It felt like peace. I walked to the large window in my study that overlooked the back garden and the small tributary of the Bracken River that flowed beyond it. I slid the window open. The night air was cool and damp, smelling of wet earth and the coming autumn. I could hear the sound of the river, a steady, gentle rushing. It was the cleanest sound I had ever heard, the sound of something moving forward, relentlessly, washing away everything in its path. I stood there for a long time, just listening. Then I took out my phone. I went to my contacts and found his name. Evan. I tapped edit. My thumbs moved across the screen, deleting the 4 letters of his name, the name of the man who had been the center of my life, in their place. I typed a new designation, a final, fitting label for what he had become to me, a case file, a piece of history. Archived for audit history. I saved the change. I put the phone down on my desk. Screen side up. For the rest of the evening, it did not ring. It did not buzz. It did not light up with a single notification. It was completely blessedly silent. And in my head, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, so was I. The constant hum of suspicion, the frantic whirring of the investigation, the strategic calculations, the low thrum of a deeply buried pain, it was all gone. The machine had been turned off. The silence was vast. It was not empty. It was clean. It was the sound of a ledger, balanced and closed. The weeks that followed the town hall were a period of quiet, methodical reconstruction, both for Northway Dynamics and for me. The forensic accountants finished their work. The final reports were filed, and the company, wounded but not broken, began the slow process of healing its self-inflicted wounds. My life, too, began to reform, not into its old shape, but into something new, something stronger. One afternoon, sitting at my desk, I pulled up the company's internal career portal. My role as head of compliance suddenly felt small. It was a role defined by enforcement, by reaction. I had spent years building walls to keep the bad things out. Now, I felt a powerful urge to build something else, a foundation. I opened a new application for an internal transfer. In the field for desired position, I didn't choose an existing role. I created a new one. I typed, Director, Corporate Ethics and Strategy. I was no longer interested in just policing the rules. I wanted to help write them, to weave a sense of integrity so deeply into the company's DNA that a crisis like the one we had just weathered would become not just impossible, but unthinkable. I detailed my vision for the role, proactive, educational, strategic, and I submitted it not to HR, but directly to the office of the chairman of the board. The response came 2 days later. I was summoned not to a job interview, but to a strategy meeting with the audit committee. They didn't just approve my proposal. They expanded it. They asked me to lead a new, top-priority, company-wide initiative. Its internal code name, suggested by the chairman himself, was Project Aegis. My task was to design and implement a next-generation, AI-driven system that could proactively detect potential conflicts of interest, flag non-compliant communications, and identify the very kinds of behavioral and financial patterns that had allowed the Blue Fern conspiracy to take root. They weren't just giving me a new job, they were handing me the keys to the fortress and asking me to redesign it from the ground up. The whistleblower file I had named on a dark night in my study was about to become the company's new shield. That Friday, I left the office at 5 o'clock. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the city. As I stepped out of the Northway Tower's gleaming glass doors and onto the bustling sidewalk, I was carrying only one thing: a simple, empty, black file folder, the binder, its contents now officially logged into the corporate archives, was no longer needed. The case was closed. My work was done. My hands were empty. A sudden gust of wind swept down the concrete canyon of the street, pulling a loose sheet of paper from a nearby kiosk. It fluttered through the air, a white ghost against the gray pavement, and landed directly in my path. I glanced down. It was a hastily printed flyer, the ink still fresh, in large, bold letters. It read, Hiring now, Senior PR Manager, Dynamic, Innovative, Results-Driven. I looked at the words, the same hollow buzzwords Claire had once used to describe herself. A year ago, a month ago, the sight might have sparked a flicker of anger, of bitter irony. Now, I felt nothing. It was just a piece of paper, an irrelevant echo from a life that was no longer mine. I stepped over it without breaking my stride, my heels clicking a steady, even rhythm on the pavement. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Avery Locke, my lawyer. The words were few, but they carried the weight of a final, binding judgment. The judge signed off this morning. All documents are filed with the county clerk. It's official. Marin, you're free. I stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change. I didn't look at the traffic. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I just stood there, a still point in the rush of the city. I took a deep breath, pulling the cool, damp Bracken Falls air deep into my lungs. It smelled of rain and exhaust, and the faint, clean scent of the river. There was no trace of Claire's cloying perfume, no hint of Evan's cheap, ambitious cologne. The air was just air, my air. I thought back to that first, brutal moment in the break room. to the words that had shattered my world. It's over. He had been right. Of course, it was over. But he had been so wrong about what that meant. He saw it as an ending for me, an erasure. He never imagined that it was not an end, but an exchange, a transaction. He thought he was closing a door on me, when all he was really doing was unlocking it. The crosswalk signal chirped, and I opened my eyes. The path ahead was clear. A small, genuine smile touched my lips, the first one that had reached my eyes in months. I looked up at the vast, gray sky, and I whispered the words to myself, a final, quiet amendment to the record. He lost a wife, I said softly, to no one and to everyone, and I found my freedom. I stepped off the curb and walked into the rest of my life. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below, and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and show some extra support by hitting that hype button. It truly helps get this story heard by so many more people.